Hey guys, and welcome to our lecture on Buddhism. Key concepts for today are going to be down here, the second half. Especially focus on comparing Hinduism and Buddhism. They're in the same chapter for a reason. And always when we're talking about a religion, focus on how well you think it's fitting into that religion's framework we talked about earlier. Our vocabulary for today has a little bit of overlap. These two relate to Buddhism, but you'll remember that I said earlier that these four relate to Hinduism. So this one here, samsara, kind of relates to both. They use some of the same vocabulary because they come from some of the same original beliefs and teachings. We'll see that in a moment. Alright, so like I said, today we're talking about Buddhism. And during the last lecture I said we'd come back to this page because I want to talk about this image here of Siddhartha Gautama. If you guys didn't know, Siddhartha Gautama is the founder of Buddhism. And a lot of you guys think, well wait, isn't Buddha or the Buddha the founder of Buddhism? Well, Siddhartha Gautama is the Buddha after he achieves enlightenment, according to the story. So Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, same thing. And when I tell folks that, they're often very puzzled because they see this image of this emaciated Buddha, very skinny, almost wasting away, and they think to themselves, well, I thought I was familiar with Buddhism and images of the Buddha, and I'm not really aware of there ever being such a thing as a skinny Buddha. I've only ever seen fat ones, or some other portrayal of this religious figure. And it's true, there is that kind of portrayal of the Buddha out there as well. But there's many different portrayals of Siddhartha Gautama, many different portrayals of the Buddha. And we're going to explain later on today why there are so many different images, different looking images of this religious figure. Alright, so where does Buddhism as a religion come from? Well, it's really important for us to understand that Buddhism actually grows out of Hinduism. That's why Spodek, correctly, I think, decided to group them together into the same chapter. So the founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, was actually a follower of the Hindu religion before. And again, it's important for us to know that connection exists because there are so many ideas that are transmitted from Hinduism, the earlier religion, to Buddhism, the adapted religion. We'll talk about some of those ideas a little bit later, but let's talk about some of the basics of Buddhism first. So how was it founded? Siddhartha Gautama, as he's traveling the world, comes to the realization that the world is basically full of suffering, and that suffering takes three major forms. There's a lot of sickness he encounters, old age, and death. And this really upsets Gautama, and he wants to try to find a way to end these problems, to end people's suffering. So, as the story goes, he sits under a tree and he meditates on this question: how do I end suffering? And he comes to the following conclusions. He says, the first truth that I've arrived at is that the whole world is full of suffering. I already knew that. All life is suffering. The second truth is that suffering is actually caused by having desires. When you want something and those wants are not fulfilled, that leads to suffering. So it kind of follows that the way to end your suffering is to end your desires. If you don't want anything anymore, then when those wants are unfulfilled, you can't suffer because there are no wants in the first place. Okay? How do you end your wants and therefore end your suffering? Well, it's by following this way of life called the Eightfold Path. Alright, so here is a visual representation of the Eightfold Path. I'm certainly not going to go through and describe each one of these things in detail, but let it suffice that this is the basic, most general moral guideline for behavior for Buddhists. All right, and like I said before, the purpose of following the Eightfold Path is to end your suffering, and when you do that, you're going to achieve what Buddhists call nirvana. And according to the original teachings of the Buddha, nirvana wasn't really like a heaven. It was just kind of a happy nothingness for your soul. How could nothingness be happy? Well, remember, the Buddha said that all life is suffering. If you go to nirvana, you're released from that suffering. It's not this beautiful, amazing place, but at least it's not a terrible place to be either. So that's nirvana under the original Buddhist teachings, and that's where you want to be, and that's where the Eightfold Path can get you. How is this related to Hinduism? Well, the Buddha taught that we all live in this cycle of rebirth, or samsara, right? Just like Hinduism, if you don't achieve nirvana under Buddhism, your soul gets reborn and placed into another being until you can eventually get there. It's different from Hinduism in that the goal in Hinduism isn't nirvana, it's moksha, remember, which is this perfect understanding where you're united with this universal soul. So the goal for your soul is different in Hinduism and Buddhism, but the cycle of rebirth that it goes through on the path to that goal is similar. So recognize those similarities and differences. We'll highlight those again soon. Okay, so this next slide is here to call your attention to a very common trend with religions, and that's change over time. Pretty much every religion we're going to look at in this unit exhibits some sort of change over time. If you think back to Hinduism, it changed by adopting new deities and practices of the new tribal groups that it came into contact with. Buddhism, on the other hand, changes in kind of a different way. It doesn't really adopt new ideas that apply to all believers of the religion, but instead, over time, it starts to split into what's called sects, right here. And a sect is just a specific subsection of a religion with its own beliefs. And if you guys are familiar with other religions, you probably know that other religions have these religious sects as well. So Buddhism splits eventually into these two sects, Theravada and Mahayana. You should know these. More details on these later. But for right now, why did they split? Well, one of the reasons is that over time, and as generations go by, folks do develop new beliefs and apply those to existing ones. Some folks who are more conservative, like to stick with the old beliefs. Some folks might adapt those old beliefs. That's why you have the more conservative approach to Buddhism here in Theravada, and you have the more adapted version of Buddhism with Mahayana over here. But there's also other reasons. You guys should know from reading about Indian empires that Buddhism eventually travels to other territories, travels out of India into China, into Southeast Asia, and as it goes to those territories, it interacts with beliefs that were already in those territories. And so to survive there, Buddhism kind of had to mesh with the beliefs that were existing. And so your Chinese style of Buddhism is going to be very different from your Indian style of Buddhism, which will be also different from your Southeast Asian or Korean or Japanese styles of Buddhism. Okay, it's all part of that cultural blending that comes with diffusion. What themes are we talking about here? Talking about migration leading to cultural blending as far as religion is concerned. Hopefully you guys guessed 1 and 2. This is a nice one of those T-chart breakdowns of similarities and differences between the original Buddhism, Theravada, and the more adapted Buddhism, Mahayana. What's in black here in the middle, similarities. Blue, of course, is unique to Theravada, and green is unique to Mahayana. won't read the whole thing for you, but I'll let you pause the video if you need to get this information. And just to reiterate, as I said last slide, as Buddhism expands, it splits further. Theravada and Mahayana are the two basic divisions in Buddhism, but within Mahayana, which is basically everything that isn't Theravada, there are plenty of other subsections of Buddhism. There are those that blended with Taoism and Confucianism in China, and there's also those that blended with Shinto in Japan. Zen Buddhism would be one example of those things. Alright guys, it's time for a little bit of image-based document fun. Like I told you guys earlier, we are going to see different representations of the Buddha, and I know it sounds kind of crazy, but these are all technically different representations of the same religious historical figure, as strange as that might seem. And many of you guys might be more familiar with this image of the Buddha, but all three of these are intended to depict the same person. My question to you guys with these images is, how can these images show us that Buddhism had a wide impact over a large geographic area? Because I've already told you that it has had that kind of impact. You know that it spread from India to China to Southeast Asia, spread to Korea and to Japan. But if you didn't know that, how could these images tell you that? Okay, so take about 3 or so minutes to find some evidence. And there's no text-based evidence here, but use some descriptions of these images that help you see that it had that wide geographic impact. See what you guys come up with in about 3 minutes, and then we'll talk about it together. Okay, well, the first thing that should really strike you as you're looking at these images is how very different they are, right? We've already talked about that. Not just different in the appearance of the individuals, but different in the artwork, the art styles that's being used to portray them, right? And also different in some of the clothes they're wearing. All these differences give us clues that some sort of different culture created these images, right? And one common theme about religions or culture in general as it travels from point A to point B is that as cultural diffusion occurs and cultural blending occurs, it's very common that a culture that is adopting some sort of cultural influence from outside its borders will try to see that culture through its own cultural lens, or try to blend that incoming culture with its own so that it's more palatable or more acceptable to the folks who are adopting that outside culture. This portrayal of Gautama over here is from India, and as you can see, the appearance of it as far as the artwork goes, very Indian in nature. The clothes that it's wearing, obviously more Hellenistic or Greek in nature, but as we already know, that style of clothing found its way from Greek culture to India, so that's why it's being depicted, the statue is being depicted wearing that kind of clothing. Over here is a Chinese depiction of the Buddha, different in the facial features, obviously, than the Indian one. Again, seeing the Buddha in the likeness of the people who adopted it. And then over here, we've got a Japanese representation. We can see, of course, that the artwork is different. The clothing is very different, say, from the Indian portrayal. And, of course, the facial features also very different. The skin tone, but also the facial structure. Again, seeing an outside culture through the cultural lens of your own people. We have an example of that here. So hopefully you guys picked up on some of that as you were looking at these documents. Okay, the end of chapter 9 closes with a comparison of Hinduism and Buddhism, so that's the same way we're going to end today. I'm not going to go through and talk about all this stuff because much of this I've already mentioned. But just know that there's a lot actually in common between Hinduism and Buddhism, like I've already talked about. The main difference here is its approach to the caste system, and we'll see that when we get back and look at the document that demonstrates that. But there really are a ton of similarities, and hopefully you can see through Spodek's grouping of these two religions together what some of the similarities were. Alright, well, I just gave you guys a set of comparisons between Hinduism and Buddhism. Now it's time for you guys to make your own. You've already seen the Eightfold Path to Nirvana over here. These are some of the paths to moksha. Remember, that perfect understanding and unity with Brahman. Take about 3 minutes. See if you can't find some similarities between these paths to the ultimate goal for your soul in these two different religions. I'll be back with you shortly, and then we'll talk about it. Alright, so what did you find? Over here we've got right thinking, right action, and religious devotion. Any connections to anything from over here in the Eightfold Path? Maybe right thinking is kind of similar to right views, right? Perhaps also right mindfulness, maybe even right concentration a little bit. Right action, that sounds a lot like it could be right conduct, right? Speech is also kind of a form of action, right? Maybe that goes under effort as well, right? How about religious devotion? Could that be considered perhaps part of your resolve, or part of your views, or your conduct, or maybe even your livelihood? Perhaps. Some of these things might be more of a stretch than others, but hopefully at least you can see some connections here, because there are some similarities, and it's not a coincidence that there are similarities. Remember that Buddhism is born from and formed out of Hinduism. It's important that we don't forget that. Alright, well, while we're talking about Hinduism and Buddhism together, let's talk about a piece of architectural history that actually exemplifies that interaction of two different religions. This is a temple at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and if you've done a textbook reading, you know that it began as a Hindu temple, but was actually converted into a Buddhist temple, a Buddhist monastery, years later. And this is one of the coolest places on the earth as far as I'm concerned, and one place that's definitely on my bucket list. I know Ms. Duddles has been to Cambodia, but I haven't, so I'm quite jealous. But I really love places like this that started out serving one purpose, and then throughout the course of its history changed to a different purpose, either religious or cultural. So whenever we see a place like this, you can bet that I'm going to talk about it, whether it's the Hagia Sophia, which transitioned from a church to a mosque and back and forth a couple times, whether it's the Cathedral Mosque at Cordoba, which we'll see later, or this temple right here, because these are almost living, breathing examples of historical, cultural interaction right in one spot. What themes are we talking about? If we're talking about the way this interaction happened, Well, you should remember that it happened through trade, right? Originally, Hinduism brought to Cambodia, and then Buddhism. We're also talking about interaction of religions. So, 4 and 2, economics and religion coming together. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in class.